I'm looking at the latest reaction around Max Verstappen and the 2026 Formula One regulations, and honestly, this is one of those stories that sounds simple at first, then gets more interesting the more you sit with it. According to reports, Sky Sports Formula One lead commentator David Croft has praised Verstappen for staying consistent, calm, and unusually firm about the new rules. And that matters because in Formula One, consistency in opinion is almost a personality trait all by itself. The 2026 rules changed a lot. The sport moved away from the ground effect era, the new formula brought a much closer split between combustion and electric power, plus overtake mode, active aerodynamics, and cars that are smaller and lighter. On paper, that sounds like the kind of engineering sentence that makes designers sit up straight and fans nod like they totally understand everything after the first paragraph. But Verstappen has apparently never been sold on the whole idea, and that is where this story becomes more than just another paddock comment. He has been skeptical for years, he has not drifted away from that view, and according to the article, he even described the new direction as Formula E on steroids earlier in the season. That is a sharp line, and whether you agree with it or not, it's hard to accuse him of saying it halfway. I think that is exactly why Croft's reaction is getting attention, because in a sport where many people speak carefully, Verstappen seems to be doing the opposite of polishing his answer until it becomes harmless. He's basically saying in the plainest possible way, this is what I think, and I am not moving just because the room is uncomfortable. And let me be honest, that kind of directness is rare enough in any sport to stand out. It's even rarer in Formula One, where every word can become a headline, every pause can be analyzed, and every mild opinion can somehow turn into a weekend-long debate. Croft's point, as presented in the article, is not just that Verstappen has an opinion, it's that he's held onto it for 2.5 to 3 years, long before it became convenient or fashionable to criticize the direction of the rules. That consistency is what Croft called refreshing, and I get why. In a world full of carefully managed answers, there's something oddly calming about somebody just saying the same thing every time because, well, they actually mean it. Of course, that doesn't automatically make the opinion right, and it definitely doesn't mean everyone else is wrong. That's where the nuance lives. The 2026 regulations were created for a reason, and those reasons are not trivial. Formula One wanted a new technical identity, a new racing balance, and a package that could reshape how the cars behave on track. The sport is always trying to solve a problem while creating 3 new ones in the process, which is basically the most Formula One thing imaginable. One side of the argument says the changes open the door to more varied driving, more strategy, and a more interesting blend of power sources. The other side worries the sport may have moved too quickly, or that the final result may not feel as engaging as the people in the rule rooms hoped. Verstappen, according to reports, has clearly been in the second camp, and Croft's praise suggests that even if the Dutchman is not the easiest person in the room to agree with, there is respect in the fact that he's never dressed up his view as something else. I think that matters because modern sports coverage often rewards the safest answer, not the most honest one. A driver says something mild, the quote is clipped, and suddenly everyone is acting like it was a grand political speech. Verstappen, on the other hand, seems to prefer the say it once, say it plainly, and stick to it. That can be frustrating if you're hoping for diplomacy, but it's also refreshing if you're tired of hearing polished answers that reveal absolutely nothing. And Croft's praise seems to capture exactly that tension. He's not saying Verstappen is automatically correct about the future of the rules. He's saying the driver has the courage of his convictions, and that's a different kind of value altogether. To me, that's the real backbone of this story. It's not just about whether the 2026 regulations succeed, it's about who in Formula One is willing to stand in one place while the rest of the room keeps shifting. Verstappen has done that. He hasn't budged, according to the article, even as the season has moved forward and the new rules have become a bigger part of the conversation. That kind of steadiness can annoy people, sure. It can also earn respect. Sometimes both happen at once, which is probably why Formula One never runs out of headlines. What I also find interesting is that Croft framed this not as political theater, but as something more genuine. He suggested that Verstappen is not simply trying to make noise for attention or force his team into a position. Instead, he's saying what he believes is right. That part is important because it separates a strong opinion from a performative one. In sports media, there's always a temptation to assume that any bold comment must be strategic, as if every sentence is secretly part of a plan. Sometimes, though, people just mean what they say. Maybe that sounds obvious, but in a sport this layered,
Obvious things often become the most overlooked. And let's not pretend the timing is boring. The 2026 regulations are a huge topic because they shape not just performance but identity. When you change how much of the car's pace comes from one system versus another, you're not just
Tweaking a setting, you are changing the feel of the championship. You're changing how drivers attack corners, how teams build pace, how engineers think about efficiency, and how fans understand what they are watching. That is a lot for one rules package to carry, and it explains why opinions around it are so emotionally charged. Verstappen skepticism, then, is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening in the middle of a broader debate about what Formula One should be in this new phase. Should it lean more into innovation and efficiency, even if some of the old character gets left behind? Or should it protect the kind of racing rhythm fans already know, even if that means slowing change? There is no easy answer, and anyone pretending there is one probably enjoys hearing themselves talk a little too much. My view is that F1 always walks this tightrope. The sport wants progress, but it also fears losing the very thing that made people care in the first place. That is why the reaction to Verstappen is so revealing. If he were just complaining for the sake of it, I do not think Croft would have called his stance refreshing. The praise suggests that even among people who may not fully share his view, there is respect for the fact that he has been steady and open about it, and that is a very specific kind of credibility. It's not built on popularity, it's built on repetition, clarity, and the willingness to take the same position even when the calendar keeps moving and the crowd keeps talking. I also think there's something almost funny in a dry Formula One way about how this story plays out. One of the best drivers in the world says he is unconvinced by a major rule direction, and the reaction is basically, well, at least he's consistent. That's not an insult, it's a compliment wrapped in a very British piece of understatement. Croft's wording, as reported, carries that tone. He's not shouting, he's not dramatizing, and he's not pretending Verstappen has solved the whole debate. He's simply recognizing that there is something admirable about a driver who does not suddenly change his story the moment the climate shifts. In a paddock full of polished messaging, that feels a little like hearing a straight answer in a room full of rehearsed ones. I think fans notice that, even if they don't always agree with the view itself, and maybe that's the heart of why this is spread. The article is not really asking us to choose a side with blind loyalty. It's showing us that the shape of the argument matters as much as the argument itself. Verstappen's opinion on the 2026 rules may or may not age well. The new regulations may ultimately work better than his early skepticism suggested, or they may run into the exact problems he expected. That part is still unfolding. What is already clear, though, is that he hasn't drifted. He hasn't softened just because it would be easier. He hasn't adjusted his tone to fit the room. And that, according to Croft, is what makes the stance refreshing. I think there's real value in that kind of sincerity, even when it's inconvenient. It tells you something about character. It tells you something about confidence. It tells you that the person speaking is willing to be measured later against the same words today. That's a fairly uncommon standard in any public arena, and Formula One is no exception. The sport is built on speed, but public opinion moves almost as fast. One weekend changes everything. One quote changes the narrative. One strong lap can make everybody forget what they were arguing about on Thursday. Against that backdrop, a driver staying in the same lane for years is noticeable. It may not be glamorous, but it is noticeable, and Croft seems to have noticed exactly that. Now, does that mean every critic of the new rules is automatically justified? No. Does it mean the regulations have already failed? Also no. That would be too neat, and Formula One is rarely neat. The more honest reading is that the sport is in a period of transition, and transitions always come with strong opinions. Some people see opportunity, some people see risk. Some people, like Verstappen according to the report, see a direction they still don't trust. And because he's Max Verstappen, that opinion carries more weight than a passing comment from someone lower down the grid. That's not fair in the abstract, but it's true in practice. Big names reshape the conversation simply by speaking. That is why Croft's reaction matters too. He's not just paraphrasing a driver, he's giving the driver's consistency its own kind of credibility. And when a respected commentator does that, it tells viewers that the comment is not just noise to be dismissed, it's part of the wider discussion. Personally, I appreciate that. I like when sports coverage leaves room for disagreement without turning every disagreement into a crisis. There's a healthy version of debate in motorsport, and this feels like one of those moments.
Nobody needs to pretend the 2026 formula is settled in everyone's mind. Nobody needs to pretend Verstappen's criticism is automatically the final word. But it's worthwhile to listen to why a four-time champion would be so steady in his view. That kind of consistency usually comes from somewhere, maybe from experience, maybe from instinct, maybe from the simple fact that when a driver spends enough time in the cockpit, they know pretty quickly whether a change feels right to them or not. And if they keep saying the same thing over and over, there's probably a reason. There's also a broader cultural angle here that I think people sometimes.
Formula One likes to present itself as futuristic, highly technical, and always moving forward, but the human side still drives the conversation. A regulation is never just a regulation. It becomes a question of trust. Do the people designing the future understand what makes the present work? Do the drivers feel heard? Do the fans feel the racing identity is still intact? Those are not minor questions. They sit underneath every big rule change, even when the public discussion looks like it is just about aerodynamics or power distribution. Verstappen's skepticism, then, is a proxy for a bigger anxiety many sports fans feel whenever their favorite game starts changing shape. It is the same feeling people get when a familiar recipe is improved by someone who clearly did not ask whether it needed improving in the first place. Sometimes the result is better. Sometimes the result is technically impressive and emotionally flat. And yes, that last part is exactly the kind of sentence that gets a nervous laugh from fans because they know the feeling. I would not say the 2026 regulations are doomed by any means. That would be lazy, and this story deserves better than lazy. What I would say is that Croft's praise highlights a rare quality in the sport: unwavering honesty. In a world that often rewards flexibility over conviction, Verstappen has apparently chosen conviction. That can be difficult. It can also be clarifying. You always know where he stands, even if you do not always like the view. And in my book, that counts for something. I respect that more than empty agreement, because empty agreement is easy. Real conviction has to survive pressure. It has to survive headlines. It has to survive the moment when everyone else decides the conversation should move on. Verstappen, according to the article, has done exactly that. He did not change his position when the 2026 talk became louder. He did not pivot once the rules were official. He did not suddenly decide the future was beautiful just because the future arrived with a press release. He stayed where he was. Croft noticed, and I think a lot of people who follow Formula One closely noticed too, even if they would phrase it differently. Some will say Verstappen is being too rigid. Some will say he is being brutally honest. Some will say the changes need more time before anyone can judge them properly. All of those reactions can exist at once. That's what makes this a real conversation rather than a slogan. And honestly, that's why I find it so watchable. It's not just a fight over a rule book. It's a test of how much the sport values consistency, and whether the people at the top are willing to say the quiet part out loud when the room prefers a softer answer. There's one more layer that makes this especially interesting to me. The idea of bravery in sports talk is often overused, but here it actually fits. I do not mean bravery in some dramatic, over-the-top sense. I mean the simpler kind. The willingness to hold a position when there is no guarantee people will applaud it. That's the kind of bravery Croft seems to be pointing toward. Verstappen did not wait for a consensus. He did not wait for the safest moment. He said what he thought early, and he kept saying it. That kind of behavior invites criticism, but it also invites respect, because it signals that the person is not outsourcing their opinion to the crowd. And in an environment as image-conscious as Formula One, that's not a small thing. I also like that Croft's take gives the story a human edge. This is not just driver says thing, commentator reacts. It's more like a reflection on what we value when a sport changes. Do we value polish, or do we value candor? Do we value compromise, or do we value a person who will keep their line even when the temperature changes? There's no perfect answer, and I would be suspicious of anyone who claims otherwise. But if the goal is to understand the mood around the 2026 regulations, then Verstappen's stance is impossible to ignore. It tells us the new era has not won over everybody. And it tells us that the debate is going to keep going, whether the sport likes it or not. That's probably healthy. A sport this big should be questioned. A rule set this ambitious should be tested by strong opinions. And a champion this prominent will always shape the conversation simply by refusing to play along with easy talking points. That does not make him the villain of the story, and it doesn't make him the hero either.
It makes him a central voice in a debate that still has a long way to go. And maybe that's the neatest way to look at this entire situation. Croft is not just praising Verstappen because he agrees with every word. He's praising the fact that the words have not changed, the line has not shifted, and the message has stayed clear. In a championship obsessed with fine margins, that kind of consistency can stand out even more than speed. So my takeaway is pretty simple. Whether you love the 2026 rules, hate them, or are still waiting to see how they actually feel in real competition, there's something worth respecting in a driver who sticks to his view without turning it into theater. That's not the loudest kind of influence in Formula One, but it might be one of the most durable. And if the new era is going to define the sport for years to come, then having people who are willing to challenge it honestly is not a problem. It's part of the process. That's why this Croft and Verstappen moment lands so well. It's not explosive, it's not messy, and it doesn't need to be. It's a reminder that in Formula One, sometimes the most interesting thing is not who changes their mind first, it's who never does. If you ask me, that's exactly why this story works. It gives us a glimpse of a champion who is not trying to please everybody, and a commentator who recognizes that straight talk still has value. In a sport built on precision, it turns out conviction can be just as revealing as lap time. And that's the part I think people will remember. Not that Verstappen complained, but that he never stopped believing what he said, long before the rest of the paddock fully settled into the conversation. That's rare. That's notable. And in Formula One, rare is usually worth paying attention to.